Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Hello, Dr. Jane.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. It's good to be together again.
Yes, it is. You know, you've mentioned numerous times in our conversations, starting with our very first episode, that it is possible to change the brain. I think it would be helpful to talk about what that means and some things that we can do to make it happen.
Sure, Anna. The brain, I find it fascinating. It has so many different networks, and it's just an amazing and kind of complex study. And there's so many wonderful intricacies and interesting parts. For our conversation, I want to keep it really very simple and straightforward because it can get kind of complicated. I also want to be open to maybe throwing out some actionable suggestions, things that we can all do that will really support the rewiring and the changing of the brain, for our greater good. So let's start with a few of the real basic concepts that could be important to know in this whole process. The first one is neuroplasticity. And you and I have mentioned this before in previous conversations. This is the malleability of the brain. It has to do with it being kind of like plastic. It is very adaptable to new learning and skills and things that go on in the experiences of life. When I was first learning about the brain, even though the science of plasticity was known, it wasn't widely talked about. And certainly in the whole area of psychology, we weren't using it. We really weren't talking about it as a measure that could be helpful, for people to change behaviors. So it's been an interesting piece to kind of see how this has come to light and how we're able to really, at this point in time, begin to really utilize this great discovery. So we have neuroplasticity, and then we also have neurogenesis. And this is the fact that the brain is producing new brain cells constantly, volumes of brain cells constantly. And again, prior to 40 years ago, we thought that once the adult brain was formed, that there were no new cells that were going to be produced. So it was really about kind of a degeneration, of what was already established. So this is really very powerful information that we have this potential, this ongoing potential to change and to grow that starts at the very beginning of our existence, actually in utero.
So it sounds like the blueprint and the architecture of the brain is set up for change.
Oh, I think you're right. And the change processes in the brain are really about adapting and learning from the experiences from the beginning of life. So next we want to look at the different parts of the brain, the three neural systems. That these are the reptilian brain, which is the primitive brain, sometimes referred to as the lizard brain, and then the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and then the cortex, which is the more sophisticated thinking brain. And sometimes people refer to a fourth brain, and it's really part of the cortex, but it's the most developed part of the cortex, right behind our forehead and eyes. It's called the prefrontal lobes. And this is probably the largest system, and really begins to develop after birth. The others are forming, really in utero. But the prefrontal cortex is always based on experience after birth. But the thing I also want to mention is that the brain never gives up anything. It's interesting about nature because nature doesn't abandon systems that work. What it does is it enlarges, it works to make the systems more efficient, and really kind of add and correct what wasn't working in the older systems. So we still have the primitive brain, and then on top of that, the limbic system and the cortex. Brain doesn't give up anything. All of these neural systems are wired together, and they're wired in this kind of open-ended potential that is integrated. However, when the integration fails, when there's a breakdown or miscommunication, it really becomes a house divided. Everybody kind of goes to their own camps and does their own thing.
Now, this is fascinating. And can you tell us more about the neural systems of the brain? I think it would be helpful to keep it simple, starting with oldest to the newest.
I think simple is good. Simple is good. Well, the reptilian brain is really about habits. It's really about those pattern ways that really help us survive. And in many ways, these patterns, because they're inherited, are learned early on for survival, they're really not changeable. We really don't look to change that. What's interesting, though, is that the reptilian brain can kind of take over some of the physical parts of a learned skill. When you think about typing or riding a bicycle or driving a car, after we learn the skill, we don't really think about the intricacies. I'm not thinking about is that after I've really learned how to drive, I'm going to put the key in my hand and I'm going to put the key in the ignition. I'm going to, there's this automatic kind of a phenomena that happens. This is where the reptilian brain comes in and really kind of takes a hold of that muscle memory, as we very often call it, that kind of body memory. That's the reptilian brain. The other piece that I find interesting about the reptilian brain is it also is key in deception. And initially it was deception for our survival. It's what allows us to not reveal what's really happening to us, kind of chameleon-like. And I think of probably the example that the terminology that we hear most often is kind of the game face, that I'm going to kind of keep this straight face and not reveal what's going on inside of me, and usually it's because it's for my own safety. I don't want anybody to know. So that's the reptilian brain. And I guess I should say that, I want to keep in mind that it is connected to the thinking brain and the limbic system. So it can be triggered. It can work with information that is passed through the cortex to the limbic system to the primitive brain, or vice versa. All right, because there is this two-way travel of information. Then we have the limbic brain. It's also called the emotional brain or the mammalian brain, because mammals tend to be very different in the sense of wanting that connection, what we would call social connection, kind of that herding, where the species want to stay together in groupings. That's part of the mammalian brain. And this is about the emotions and the reactivity that come with that. All right. It's a little more evolved than that primitive brain, and really works in our favor to make those connections and to keep us safe. And then we have the neocortex. And the neocortex is the third brain. This is, it's amazing because it involves probably 100 billion neurons. Incredible. And each of those neurons, each of those brain cells are really connecting to about 100,000 other neurons. So it's creating this neural field. And in this particular part of the brain occupies more real estate in the brain than the two other brains combined. So it is ongoing, more sophisticated, always learning, always growing. And then we have that prefrontal cortex that I mentioned, which is sometimes considered a fourth brain, that is really moving us into higher intellectual capacities. The capacity for human values, things like compassion, things like empathy and understanding, is really the development of the prefrontal cortex. People sometimes refer to it as the angel brain because it is about being more evolved. It is about what it is to be fully human in the highest sense of the word. So this connection, with all of these parts is really intimate and ongoing. Every part of the brain is connected to every other part of the brain, to the point where it's sometimes hard to know where something starts, and how it first traveled or where it first traveled from, that it's triggering the other parts of the brain, because everything very often comes on board when everything's moving and working properly.
Wow, that's incredible. Four brains from primitive to modern, all working together, yet each has a different job. What a great design.
It really is, Anna. It really is. And the interconnection piece is of the greatest importance, because it's not about there's one standalone. It is about how it's integrated. But I want to talk about another part of the brain that is so very important, and that is the amygdala. At the very center of the brains is this almond-shaped organ called the amygdala. And we've talked about this in previous conversations, that this is we've called it the smoke detector. That this is that organ that's intimately connected to the survival network. It's in the primitive brain, and also triggered by sensory information of the emotional brain. And the thinking brain information also has a lot to do with how this gets fired up or how it becomes reactive. And because of its position and the pathways that it's involved in, it initiates the physical experience of fear and anxiety. So this is kind of the center of it. It releases hormones into the body that activate body sensations immediately. I mean, it's just literally in a heartbeat. So it activates this survival mechanism, and because it's wired to save our life. So it has to respond quickly. The key is that sometimes it reacts before the thinking brain can determine whether or not it needs to really react this strongly or this intensely. Okay, because it responds to the danger, whether it's real or imagined, and triggers this fight or flight response. So you can see that it has this huge influence over the body, huge influence. And then we also have the amygdala is also connected to the cerebral cortex. And with this, the smoke detector can be set off by thinking, because the cortex kind of oversees things like planned action. It can initiate experiences and responses to things that are happening in the environment. It has everything to do with our sensory experience. Something can set us off, the smell of smoke or heat, or, that allows us to pull away from a pan that's hot. This is all things working together. Or to know that I mustn't touch a hot something or other that's in the kitchen. That's that thinking and that planned cerebral cortex that's working with that survival mechanism to keep me safe. It's also important to know that the cerebral cortex, because the thinking brain can go beyond what's just actually happening in the moment, it can anticipate or interpret experiences, both things that are happening within me and also externally. And this is what can kind of get us into some trouble along the way when our interpretation is faulty, or when our interpretation is faulty, or our anticipation is joined with some kind of a negative thought process. But the piece that can be troublesome of all this, particularly with the cerebral cortex, is something called cognitive fusion, that we begin to believe that our thinking is fact, that it's the ultimate reality. And very often with all of this, we have the primitive brain and the limbic system kind of moving into this reactivity. Our body is telling us something's terribly wrong. And if our thinking begins to label it as such, there we are. That becomes our reality.
Well, Dr. Jane, it can feel so real. And even when it's absurd, it can still feel like real, especially when we're all worked up and in reactivity.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Anna. And that's the point. The fear and the anxiety and the worry can be created by the thinking. It's created by the thinking brain. It has a lot to do with our conditioning, that backstory that we've talked about, the beliefs, the history. And as I said, the anticipatory thinking can also become very, very powerful, because especially if it's paired with a negative content of some kind, and that will trigger then, the limbic system. The limbic system is connected to the primitive brain, and we can get really fired up. We can really go into high level reactivity and begin to actually predict the future from these imagined outcomes. So we're creating a danger that really isn't there. There is none there. But my thinking brain And the more I'm into the cognitive fusion, the more it becomes, this is the way life is. This is what my reality is. So, so while fear can keep us away from real danger, our neural system is wired in a way that we can also learn to be afraid of things, that really aren't dangerous.
Yeah. Well, this is sounding very familiar. Our thinking is so powerful. Can you tell us more about the pitfalls in the thought process?
Well, sure. I mean, sometimes fears, because they're damaging to our self-esteem and self-concept, they go undercover. Okay, we don't have access to them. They're kind of stuffed in our unconscious mind, and this fear can handicap us, um, because it's below consciousness. It's below the conscious surface, and it works through different mechanisms. So different kind of mechanisms show up. Things like perfectionism. There's fear below that I have to do everything just so. Procrastination. Sometimes that's fear of success. Sometimes it's fear of failure. Or not believing that I can get, really accomplish what I want to accomplish. Fear is underneath there. Anxiety is underneath there. Chronic disorganization is also, one of the symptoms of this kind of underlying fear. Ambivalence in decision making. Things like self-sabotage, or not working up to my potential, can also have this fear underneath. Social anxiety and shyness sometimes has that fear at the base of it. The inability to commit, whether that's to another person or to a project or a follow through. And sometimes it even shows up with how we choose friends that maybe don't challenge us or don't share our ideals. Yeah.
So, what you're saying is that the fear goes into hiding and shows up in some dysfunctional behavior.
That's exactly right. And another way that fear presents is with negative thinking styles, negative thinking patterns. These can be real traps, and we all have them. In fact, some of us have more than one. I personally am a collector. There's several that I enjoy, but we usually have our favorites. And there are things like overgeneralizing, where we have one incident that maybe didn't turn out well, and we're just convinced that everything that has anything to do with that is just going to be plumb, ugly. So overgeneralizing, our catastrophic thinking, where we again, there's a single event, and it doesn't go well, and all of a sudden, as we begin to think about it and dwell on it and wallow in it, it becomes huge. Scarcity thinking, that sense of life isn't enough, doesn't offer enough time, money, love, and always looking at the deficits, how there's not enough to go around or not enough for me. Black and white thinking, the extremes, that real polarized kind of thinking, that can be oftentimes it's like the fear of making a mistake, in how I look at something. So it's either black or white. Shame and blame, very often come out of that kind of fear and anxiety, comparing ourselves to others, judging. Most regrets and guilt come out of this. That's a mechanism that works in the obvious conscious world. Self-doubt. There's also mind reading. It's one of my favorites. Especially when you know someone well, we want to assume that we know what they're thinking and why they're thinking of it. And also emotional reasoning. If I feel a certain way, then that's true. So it's like something like I feel stupid about something, and therefore I must be stupid. It's that kind of emotional reasoning, that kind of leap into, well, that's real.
Yes. Well, I can certainly identify with a few of those, Dr.
I said we all have our favorites.
Right. Well, absolutely. This is quite a list. I can identify on my own traps, and I was also aware of typical responses of people I know as you ran through that list. So where do we begin to change these patterns?
Well, often these types of negative patterns can be addressed with something, at least in part, by a technique that's been around for a long time now. It's called cognitive restructuring. And certainly in cognitive therapy, they really use this. It's like if you change your thinking, then you'll change your feelings and you'll change your behavior. And when you think about how the brain is wired, it makes sense. It makes sense. The key is very often you can't do it in high reactivity. You have to wait till things kind of settle, and then it's about going back to it. And it's really about kind of dissecting and discrediting the premise behind the negative pattern. So, like with black and white thinking, it's we would want to consider that the space in between, kind of the gray matter rather than black or white. What are the different shades of that gray? What are the possibilities between the extremes where we might land at least some of the time? With mind reading, it's as simple as kind of engaging in the premise that I don't know what's going on in someone else's head, and if I want to know, I need to check it out with them. It's also to recognize, when I have preconceived notions or ideas or opinions, and allowing myself, and this is that backstory in our history and the conditioning, to kind of turn toward that and allow myself to be more open-minded, allow myself to shift and adjust rather than always being anchored in that conditioning.
Yeah. Like we've said in past conversations, turning toward the thinking and beliefs and see what's really there, see what's behind the fear and anxiety.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And let me just say too that it isn't necessary, nor is it possible to eliminate all fears. But we really don't need to. Fear is an appropriate phenomena in some situations. Like if there's a lightning storm outside and I'm in an open field, I'm going to head to the house or head to shelter. I mean, it's just the way it is. That is just common sense that is really dictated by fear of something could, something fatal could happen. But what we want to look for is we want to look for how is the fear and how is the anxiety interfering with the quality of my life. So is it preventing me from achieving, important goals? Is it causing me to have stress that's affecting my health, my relationships, my self-esteem? Or does it occur so frequently that it's really being disruptive to my life? And then the key is to pick out a fear or an anxiety or an unwanted behavior that stems from fear and anxiety, and start there. So we want to start with something that's believable and achievable, and there are techniques and practices, that can shift our response to fear. We've talked about many of them, and they can shift this by restructuring our thinking, by allowing ourselves to quiet the physiology, retrain the amygdala, we're actually quiet our whole neural system, and really help us write new narratives, write different ways of operating. But so often it requires learning how to quiet. We talked about the relaxation response. We've talked about, many other techniques, energy techniques that really intervene in this process.
So we're really facing into the reality and admitting how bad it is, how much it's robbing us of the life that we want, and reminds us of how we have to start somewhere. I mean, you eventually have to start somewhere, right?
Well, that's really true, Anna. And in all of these, the key is to allow ourselves to experience the triggers and the reactivity. I mean, this is a key component in rewiring the brain. We have to feel the feelings. We have to feel the reactivity. This also requires us, as you say, the awareness. And as you said, turning toward the discomfort is really how we've framed it in all of our conversations. So then it's about making a different choice, not making our usual choice. And this is the conscious choice that actually performs the rewiring, that actually triggers that rewiring component and impacts the change process, because the neurons are then firing various networks in different directions, in different ways. And this has to be followed by, this is a must, it has to be followed by repetition. We have to continue to do it. Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah. This is like the saying, fear the fear and do it anyway, right? Yet what we do and how we do it is also important, and even more important that we keep doing it.
That's absolutely right. And the conscious choice is the piece that's distinctly different from our conditioned patterning, the conditioned way that we've done things. And so we have to activate the fear. We have to be in that fear and activate that fear circuitry to generate these new connections, because I have to feel that, and then I have to redirect the neural firing. And I do that with a conscious choice. And sometimes if fear is great, we probably want to do this kind of in gradients, kind of slow approximations. And this will bring us closer to, where we want to be, closer to the real experience, and also to the change process. So, for instance, kind of a prime example would be how we very often work with phobias, which is called successive approximation. And so, say you have a fear of elevators, we might start with teaching you how to quiet your body, doing a relaxation response, and then showing you pictures of elevators. Okay. And you're keeping yourself as calm as you can. You're looking at the pictures. And then next, we might have you imagine yourself on an elevator and keeping yourself calm with the relaxation response. And then we've moved to maybe standing on a non-moving or standing in a non-moving elevator and keeping yourself calm, right? And eventually, you'll need to ride various elevators over time, always modifying that reactivity with the quieting experience that you've learned, the quieting skill that you've learned.
Well, what else can we do to rewire?
Well, the current research, interestingly enough, you'll be delighted to hear this, says that mindfulness training and practice are some of the best ways to retrain and quiet the amygdala, some of the best ways to identify triggers and retrain the whole fear network so that it's responding differently. And it also, in the mindfulness practice, allows us to access conscious choice. So, all of the main ingredients are there. And it all happens through that initial piece of cultivating that observer self part of our consciousness, where I stand in my awareness and I'm observing what's happening. Now, in neuroscience, this is called metacognition, but clearly it's the key. And it allows us to step out of the reactivity, yet the reactivity is still there. We're not denying the reactivity, we're not suppressing it or avoiding the experience. It really stands in that place where I can make a different choice because I'm observing what's happening, but I'm not adding to the drama. And in making that different choice, the neural firing will be redirected and the pathways, new pathways, will be constructed.
All this information is so validating. It's amazing on how so many of our conversations point in this direction.
You're right, Anna. There are also just a whole laundry list of other things that we can be doing that support this rewiring process. Things as simple and straightforward as, I probably shouldn't say simple and straightforward because it could really be a lot of efforting. Improved fitness, breathing techniques, simple breathing techniques like our concentration and any quieting techniques. We have a myriad of those, in our library with Conversations for the Good. And the most recent one is the relaxation response, which is an excellent one and short and sweet and very good. Effective communication also promotes rewiring of the brain. Smiling, because we're really changing the formula in how the networks are firing, because we're popping endorphins in the brain just by smiling. Gratitude is another one. We talked about gratitude, and how gratitude can shift the stress hormones in the body and provide more neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that allow us to feel better. Good sleep hygiene is another one that's incredibly important. That should probably be the top on the list. Positive social support, positive social engagement with people is extremely important for rewiring the brain and supporting that process. Maintaining our values, things that are important to us, living out of one's honor code also supports this. Something as simple as listening to good music is wonderful for rewiring the brain. And also settling our neural system, can be wonderful. There was a fellow by the name of Don Campbell who did some amazing work with some of Mozart's work and really prove scientifically how that can calm the brain and calm the neural system. Learning new skills, learning a new language, learning how to play a musical instrument can be marvelous in helping us rewire the brain. Anything that is a new learned activity. Paying positive attention, and I'm going to say this again, positive attention to our bodies. Okay, this isn't about criticism, but positive attention, self-compassion, giving loving care to someone or something. Something as simple as a plant or a pet can change the neural system. Ellen Langer, back in Harvard, probably 20 or 30 years ago, did a study on this and showed that people were happier just by taking care of a plant. Amazing. Also creativity, huge, because there's something about the movement in that prefrontal cortex that allows us more neural activity. It's wonderful. And the other piece that we've talked about time and time again, Anna, is to really try to avoid being too hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. That halt, bottom line, to support our rewiring and just a healthy life in general.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a list and many possibilities to choose from. I know I'm going to continue this process, and I hope that others will join us. It is life-changing, Dr. Jane. I know it has been for me. So thank you so much. And until our next conversation.
Thank you, Anna.